Hi everyone. So today we'll be learning how to make a search bar in React. So you can enter into the input field over here and you can type in a few letters and you can see that the search bar fetches some data from an API and renders data relevant to your search query. So this is an amazing project if you're a beginner, because not only will we be making a React project from scratch where we go through the HTML, CSS and JavaScript, but we'll also be learning how to fetch data from an API and render it onto the front end. So without much further ado, let's get started. Now, I'm assuming you have npm installed on your machine before we begin. So we'll go to our IDE of choice and open up the IDE wherever you want to start the project. And we'll open up the terminal. And now, usually when you start React projects, you might have used something called Create React App. But today we'll be using something called Vite. It's a lot more lightweight and it's a lot faster than Create React App. So that's what we'll be going with today. So to get started with Vite, what you'll have to do is write down npm create Vite at latest. And now this should take us through the entire procedure of setting up our project. So we'll name the project React Search Bar. And then you can see it has a lot of options for many JavaScript frameworks, but we'll choose React. And then today we'll be going with JavaScript, but you can choose TypeScript if you want. And if you can see here that it's created our entire project. And it's also given us some commands we have to run to get started. So let's do cd react search bar, which takes us into the directory in our terminal. Then we run npm install to install the relevant dependencies. And then once that's done, we'll install another dependency which we need for our project, which is npm install react-icons. We'll need this for some icons we'll be using in our project. And now to start our project, we'll just run npm run dev. And this should get our project running. And as you can see at localhost 5173, we can see our project. So let's refresh in our browser over here. And you can see we have a simple landing page. So now Vite has created loads of files for us, but we don't need many of them. So we'll go to the left-hand side over here and begin cleaning up stuff. So first of all, you can delete this public folder over here. And then you can open the src folder and go into app.jsx, and you can basically delete everything inside the main div. You can also delete this state over here, and you can delete this import of the React logo. And that's it for this file. You can go into app.css and delete all the styling over here as well, and save both of these files. We can also go into index.css and delete all the styling here as well. And then go into app.jsx and just write hello world. And as you can see, the page is being refreshed on the right hand side automatically whenever we save our files. So to begin with adding the elements, we'll create a div which will contain both our search bar and the results. So we'll create the div and we'll give it a class name of search bar container and save that. Within that, we'll create a div which will represent the search bar. And then another div which will represent the search results. These are just placeholders and we'll create the actual components later on. But to begin with, let's add some styling to this page so it looks a bit nicer. So we'll go into app.css and begin by adding some styling to our app component. So we'll target it by saying .app. We'll give it a background color of EEE and save that. As you can see, it has a grayish background here. We'll give it a height of 100% of the viewport height and a width of 100% of the viewport width. Now you'll see there's a white border around this component. So we'll go into index.css and basically say that for the entire page, by using this asterisk, we should add these following properties. So we'll begin by adding a box sizing of border box. We'll say the default margin on each component should be 0 pixels and the default padding on each component should also be 0 pixels, and save that. And now you see that the app component fills up the entire page. Then we'll go back into app.css and we'll add some styling for our search bar container. We'll say search bar container. We'll give it a padding on the top of 20 times the viewport height. so that it moves down a little bit. We'll give it a width of 40% of the parent component. And then we'll move it to the center by saying margin auto. We'll make it display flex. Give the flex direction to be column. Align the items to the center of the column. And then we'll give a minimum width of 200 pixels. This is so that if the width of the page decreases below 200 pixels, the component doesn't decrease in size. So now that we have the app set up, we'll go into creating the search bar component. So for that, we'll go into the src folder and create a new folder called components. We'll create a new file for our search bar component and say search bar.jsx. Make sure to make it a JSX file because Vite doesn't like JS files. It has to be JSX. Now we'll create the functional component for this. So I have an extension where you can just write RAFC and it creates the boilerplate code for that. So now we have a search bar component, and then we can go into app.jsx and remove this line over here and just say search bar, and it should automatically import it like so. As you can see, it still shows the same content. So we'll go into search bar.jsx and start adding some elements in here. So we want the outside to be a div and we want to give it a class name of input wrapper. And this will contain two things, the search icon as well as the input which will take in the text. So to add the icon, we will go to the top and we will say import fa search from react icons/fa. This is the package which we installed earlier via npm. Now we'll go back into the component and we'll add it by writing down fa search and then closing this tag. We'll also give it an ID of search icon so that we can add some styling to it later. And if we save that, on the right hand side we can see that there's a search icon. And then below this we want to add an input which will take in the text, and we'll give it a placeholder which will say type to search. And that's the initial markup that we have. Now let's add some styling to this, and then we'll come back to this JSX file for adding the functionality. So to do that, we'll create another file over here called searchbar.css. We'll go back into the JSX and we need to import it. So we'll say import./searchbar.css. Now we go back into searchbar.css and this is where we add the styling. So firstly, we want to target the input wrapper, which is the div around the search icon as well as the input. So we say .input wrapper. We'll give it a background color of white. And now you can see what the div looks like. You can see a slight white background color behind this search element. We'll give it a width of 100%, so it takes up the entire width of its parent. We'll give it a border radius of 10 pixels, so it's a bit more rounded. We'll give it a height of 2.5 rem, so it's a bit taller. We'll give it a padding horizontally by saying 0 vertical padding and 15 pixels horizontal padding. We'll add a shadow to it so it's easier to see. So we'll say box shadow and 0 pixels offsets on the X and Y and an 8 pixel blur and a color of DDD. We'll save that. I can see it has a slight shadow. Then we'll say display flex and align items to the center. So now you can see it's vertically aligned, all the elements inside it. Now we need to add some styling to the input element itself. So we'll say input. We'll give it a background color of transparent. We'll remove any border that it has. We'll give it a height of 100% of its parent. We'll change the font size to be 1.25 rem. We'll make the width 100% of its parent. And we'll give it a margin on the left hand side of 5 pixels, so it's a bit more spaced apart from the search icon. Now, so the styling looks good, but if you click onto the element, we see we have an outline over here and we want to remove that. So to target that, we'll say input, and whenever it's focused, we want the outline to be none. And now you can see there's no outline when you focus on the input element. And then lastly, we want to give a little bit of color to the search icon. So we'll say hash search icon since it's an ID, and we'll say color, and we'll give it a color of royal blue. And we save that, and we can see that we have the search bar over here with the correct stylings applied. Now let's go back into the JSX file to add some functionality. The first thing we want to do is to be able to figure out what the user has entered. And for that, we need the useState hook from React. So we'll get the useState hook. And you can see that you can type in any text right now, but we want to store this into a stateful variable. So we'll come into the component over here and we'll say const input, which is the variable that we'll be taking a look at. Set input, which can be used to change what the variable's value is. And we say use state and give it an initial value of an empty string. Now we'll come into the input element over here and we'll say that the value should be whatever the value of the input variable is. And we'll say that on change, whenever the user changes the value inside this, take in the event and set the input variable to the value inside this input element by e.target.value. And we can see over here that the typing still works, but now it should be stored inside the input variable. Next, what we want to do is whenever the user inputs some text, we want to fetch data from an external API. So for that, we'll create another function inside this component, which will be called const fetch data. This will take in some value, which is the text to search for. And over here, we'll have to make a call to the relevant API. So the API we'll be calling is called JSON placeholder. It's a very cool service which allows you to make fake API calls to this URL, and it sends you some mock data. So we'll be making a request to the user's endpoint. So we'll go back into our code and we'll use the fetch API for this. So this should take care of fetching data from an external API. So we'll say https /JSON placeholder typecode.com/users. Now this should make a request to the API, but we need to call this function whenever the text changes in our search bar. So instead of having the on change be just the set input, we'll create another function which will be called const handle change. This will take in a value, and the first thing it will do is set the input variable to the given value, which is the same as what we're doing over here. And then it will also pass in the value to the fetch data function. And this will make a request to the relevant API. Now we'll come down here and instead of doing set input, we'll change this to handle change. And whenever we change the text now, it will make a request to the fetch data API. Without going into too many details of asynchronous JavaScript, this fetch function is asynchronous. So whenever you have an asynchronous function which returns a value later on in time, you have to chain a .then function onto it, which awaits for this result and then performs actions on it. Then we have to convert this response into the JSON format, which can be read by JavaScript. So we'll say response.json. We can chain another .then onto that, and we get back the JSON value. And what we can do is we can just console.log the JSON value that we get back and save that. So let's go back to our app and open the DevTools by entering Command Option I. and let's enter some text, and we can see that we get back an array over here, and each array element is an object with an address, company, email, and the name which we care about the most. So now that we're done with fetching the data, we only want to render the data which matches the text we have inside our input element. So we'll add that functionality over here after we get back the JSON data. So what we want to do is filter the JSON data and store it into a variable called results. So we'll say results is equal to JSON, and we'll be using a function, an array function called filter. And this will basically go through each element inside our array and take in the user at the specific index. And what we want to do is return true if it matches the text inside our input element, and return false if it doesn't match it. So we'll return, first we'll check if the current user exists at the current index, and then we'll check if user has a name, and then we'll check if the user's name converted to lowercase includes the value entered into our search field, and we'll go ahead and save that. And then we want to log this out, so we'll say console.log results, and then we'll refresh our page and then enter some text, and we see there's only 9 elements. If we type in more text, it keeps getting narrowed down until we only have one element, which is Leanne, which matches our text. Now, if we go ahead and delete every element, you will see that we have 10 elements over here. But the thing is, if the input field is empty, we don't want to render anything. So over here in the filter function, we'll also check if there's a value given by the user at all. And if the value is empty, then we won't render anything. So if we type in L, we'll get back 9 results. But if there's nothing, we have an empty array. So nothing will get rendered in the search results. Something I would like to point out here is that we're getting data from the API again and again, and we're filtering it on the front end side. But usually what would happen is that you would send this value back to your backend via the URL over here or in the body of the request, and you would only get back the relevant data. So you wouldn't need to be filtering on the front end side. But for the sake of this project, we're just filtering on the front end side. So now that we're able to get back the relevant data from the API and log it out, we need to show it to the user via the UI. So to do that, we'll go back into app.jsx. So what we want to do over here is create another stateful variable which will contain the results we've gotten back from the API, because we want to be able to modify this array using the search bar, and we want to send it into our search results component so it can render it out. So we'll go to the top over here and we'll say const results, which is the variable, and set results, which can modify this variable, is equal to use state, and we'll set it to an empty array initially. Now we want search bar to be responsible for modifying this array, so we'll pass it in as a prop. So we'll say set results is equal to the set results function we have over here. Then we go into search bar and we take it in as a prop by opening the braces over here and saying set results. Once we have that, we no longer need to console.log the results. We can just say set results and pass in the results variable we have over here. Now whenever the input gets changed, it will fetch the data from the API, filter it based on the text in the input, and then set the results variable to whatever we get back, which will be stored in this variable over here. And since it's being stored over here, we want to pass it into our search results component and render that out. So instead of having this placeholder over here, we'll create a new component inside our components folder. So let's go over here and create a new component, and we will call it search results list.jsx. Again, do RAFC to create the component, and here it is. We'll come back over here and remove this placeholder and just say search results list. It's auto imported, and then we'll close this tag and then pass this results variable as a prop into this. So now let's go back into the search results list component and add the markup. So we want the outer div to have a class name of results dash list, and we want some divs inside it which will contain the list elements. So we'll just create some placeholders for now. So we'll say A, B, and C. Now you can see it being rendered out over here. So let's add some styling to our list. So we'll create another file called search results list.css, and we'll import it over here by saying import dot slash search results list.css. Now we'll go into the CSS and add the styling. So we'll target the results list div. We'll say it should be 100% width of its parent. We'll give it a background color of white. We'll display it as a flex, but the flex direction should be column. We'll also give it a box shadow so it's a bit easier to see. So a box shadow, 0 pixel, 0 pixel, 8 pixel blur, and a color of DDD. We'll give it a border radius of 10 pixels. We'll give it a margin on the top of 1 rems to space it a bit out from the input. We'll give it a max height of 300 pixels. And then whenever we have more elements than the maximum height, we'll say overflow Y and scroll. So we're doing this. Let me show you an example of why. So if we have loads of elements like this, instead of increasing in length forever, there's a maximum height it goes to, and then we can scroll through the results. Now that we're done with the styling, let's add some functionality. So we'll remove all the placeholders over here that we have, and instead take in the results as the props that are being passed down to it. And now what we want to do is that we want to go through each result and map the value in each result to a new div. So we'll add some braces so we can add code in between the markup. We'll say results.map. So this will go through each element inside the results array and map it to a new component. So we'll take in the result at the given index. We'll take the index as well that we're currently at. And we'll use an arrow function and we'll say return. For now, we'll just do a div. We'll use curly braces here and we'll say result.name is what should be rendered. And we'll also give it a key, because whenever you're creating a for loop like this, every element you create should have a key. And now when we go to our UI and we add in some text, it renders out whichever users match our input. Now the styling isn't looking that great. So instead of having each result as a div, we'll create a new component to represent each result. So we'll go back into the components folder and create a new component called search result. So search result.jsx. Again, do RAFC to create the component. We'll take in the result it has to render as a prop, and between this div tag, we'll just say render out the relevant result. And then we'll go back into the search results list. Instead of having this div over here, we'll return a search result component. To it, we'll pass the result variable. So result is equal to result. And as before, we'll give it a key of the current ID. And we're getting an error over here because instead of passing the result, we have to pass in the result.name, which is the name of the current user at the specific index. And now it should work the same. So let's go and add the styling to the search result component. So we'll create a new CSS file by saying search result.css. And we'll import it into the search result component by saying import./search result.css. To the div, we'll add a new class name, which will be called search-result. And then we'll go into the CSS file and target it by saying search-result. And all we'll do is add some padding to it. So padding 10 pixels and 20 pixels. Let's search for something, and you can see that it looks a lot better. And what we want to do is that whenever we hover over an element, we want to highlight it. So we'll say dot search result, and we'll say hover. And whenever we do that, we want to change the background color. So we'll set a background color of EF. Let's save that and refresh the page. And let's type in L. And whenever we hover over an element, it gets highlighted, and we can also scroll. Another thing you'll notice is that the font inside this element isn't sans serif, it's Times New Roman. So we'll go back into index.css, and inside this asterisk, just say font family and set it to Helvetica. And if that's not found, apply any sans serif font. Let's save that, and it looks a lot better now. Lastly, what we want to do is detect whenever an element inside our list is clicked. So we'll go back into search result.jsx and add in an onClick function. So we'll say onClick and get the click event, and then just make an alert dialog which says you clicked on, and then by string interpolation we can pass in the result which was clicked on. So alert, you clicked on the given result. Let's save that and refresh and type in L. You can highlight the element that you're hovering over, click on it. It says you clicked on object, and that's again because we're passing in result instead of result.name. So let's just fix that. Result.name. Let's save it, refresh, type in something again, and it shows the name that was clicked on. So that's about it for the search bar component. If you want to take a look at the code, the link for the GitHub repo will be given in the description down below. If you like this video, do like, comment, and subscribe. And if you have any suggestions for any other tutorials, do let me know.